Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me at the back? Oh, that's good to see nodding heads. Thank you very much, Helen. That was a lovely introduction, very warm, and I'm most appreciative to be here back in Sydney for the first time in a decade. I'm certain that I will see a lot of changes over the next week ahead. I'm also a little bit tired, having arrived today, so you'll forgive me, I hope, if I pause for a moment and search for the right word. Nevertheless, I've really never considered myself a morning person, and given that it's, I think, somewhere around 5 in the morning my time, I'm actually enjoying the fact that it's evening. I had a lovely walk here, just through the campus, and I remarked on how beautiful a spring day it is. I'm going to share a lot of images and examples that come from my homeland in the southern portion of Canada, where I live on what used to be the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. It is no longer that way. But what is similar about the place that I live and the place in which I stand now is that we are a border nation of sorts, in that most of the people live along our border, our shores, as it were. And so some of the issues around resilience that I'll talk about touch on what it is to be in a very large landscape with relatively few people, and many concentrated in urban centers. That much Canada and Australia share, and I think you'll see that in some of the images that I show, or at least some of the concepts of resilience. I've been working on resilience both as a landscape ecologist and a planner now for 20 years, long before it was a fashionable term, and also at a time when it was borrowed from various literatures, and being something of a magpie academically, I come from several different disciplines, and I enjoy collecting pieces of those disciplines to see what kind of transdisciplinary knowledge can transpire. And I have found that at the moment in which we live, never before has this kind of knowledge had the kind of import that it does now, although still we seem to lack the political will to put that into motion. And one of the great fortunes of my career has been to work with designers who've shown me tangible, practical and creative ways to use the agency of design to unlock possibility. And so that's what I want to speak to you about in the next 45 minutes or so. I want to talk about thinking and doing and making resilience beyond rhetoric. In many ways, somebody told me quite recently that, well, isn't that just a term for sustainability? I mean, has that term gone out of fashion? And I think possibly why we're here to talk about is whether or not resilience unlocks possibility for a new sustainability. However, we have to dig a little bit deeper. I'm going to come back to this image on the screen behind me as I move through some of the lecture, because it has particular resonance for me as a Canadian in a landscape that sees water in many different formats, but also in the beauty of a landscape that is contained in some respect in its infrastructure, its green infrastructure, the trees in the image behind me. So they'll figure into some of my conversation. I recently published a couple of different pieces on resilience that had to do with this concept in large cities, and in fact, bringing the idea of nature into cities. And I hope that you may be able to find some of these, at least online. I try to make most of the material available for many people. As Helen mentioned in the introduction, I've also been working with Chris Reed at Harvard University on this publication called Projective Ecologies, in which we unpack ideas about contemporary understandings in ecology as it provides material for landscape and architecture. So resilience figures also in some of this work. But why resilience now? What is it about the present moment? And I'd argue that there are really 5 key pillars, at least for me, that I can understand how it is that resilience is becoming more important daily. And I would say that the first is the shift in ideas about urbanism. There's the physical shift in people migrating to cities. We know this is a global trend. We know that here in the doorstep of the Anthropocene, more humans live in human settlements than ever before. And certainly in a size of those settlements that is unprecedented. We're also seeing, along with this, the decline of our physical human-built infrastructure. So at least in the Western industrialized areas, and particularly in the north, We know that the major public infrastructural investments that were made after the Second World War are now reaching the end of their logical life cycle, their physical life cycle. And so we're seeing a physical breakdown and a decline of infrastructures that were built at a different time to serve different needs. Some might even argue that those infrastructures themselves are part of the problem. We're also seeing an emergence and a rise in discussion about ecology. To some, ecology is a fashionable word for political movement. To others, it's new discoveries daily in how species and habitats interact to provide something we know is resilience. But ecology is everywhere, and it risks being nowhere unless we understand the material qualities. The other point I'd make is that landscape as an idea, at least in the Western countries, has undergone a kind of renaissance, a rebirth of understanding that it is no longer just about beautiful gardens or vistas, although those things are important, but landscape itself has a material quality to invest in ideas about resilience. The reality of climate change is upon us. It's not something actually you can choose to believe in or do so at your peril. We've seen plenty of that, particularly in North America during this year's North Atlantic hurricane season. I know there's a corollary in the Southern Hemisphere, but I've plenty of experience at this particular moment with what's going on in the Northern Hemisphere. All of this leads to new openings and a new agency for design, I will argue, as we unpack the ideas of resilience. We also know that there's been a considerable investment paid into how to make our cities, this large growth of urbanism, more resilient. And this is in large part funded and paid for by the US Rockefeller Foundation, now a global foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation has created a program known as the RC100 program, the Resilient Cities 100, now I think into the second series of 100 cities. Is Sydney a resilient city? I believe it is. I think it's one of the first of the 100 series. So is Toronto, and so is New York, and so is Vancouver, and so on. So this program ostensibly promotes deeper understandings of policy initiatives and tactics towards resilience. Whether or not that's happening, we don't know so well yet, but we know that that's the intention. So this is a significant political movement, and it's one that, at least in my lab's research, seems to suggest is capturing the conversation. So if one organization has the power to shape a conversation, how do academics and practitioners respond to this? How do we test these ideas of resilience? And my argument here is that we need not to do this blindly. It's important for us to engage varieties of different types of research to do so. Recently, the American Society of Landscape Architecture produced an online publication to guide practitioners in the Guide to Resilient Design. This is a collection of a series of projects and ideas about resilience from around the world that is a good first step in making real strides towards resilience through design. It's the first one of its type that I've seen, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So if we talk about resilience, we have to unpack a little bit of theory. But before that, we can understand what is the difference between the way policymakers talk about resilience, the rhetoric that we hear in the public media, the science behind it, some of which is non-science and some of which is just plain nonsense. So I'd like to make a little tour of that to assess where we are and what is our understanding. Some of how we come to resilience, though, is fairly obvious. The conversation started, at least in the North, after August 2005 and Hurricane Katrina, which swept into the Gulf of Mexico and leveled the city of New Orleans, which conveniently or not conveniently, depending on your perspective, sits below sea level. We also saw November 2012, another major storm, this one called Superstorm Sandy. It wasn't particularly super by North American tropical storm standards, but it was, considering it struck Manhattan, and lower Manhattan in particular. And this image showing lights out after the storm gives you some sense of the vulnerability of the coastal area of Manhattan. The next major opportunity in my hometown, which didn't receive quite the same amount of press, as for good reason, because there weren't any deaths resulting from this storm. But this was interesting because in a city of 5 million people that is not unlike Sydney in its population size and ethnocultural diversity and relative emphasis on technology and the information sector, our city was literally underwater after a 2-hour deluge that happened in midsummer, at a time when we normally get good rain, but not torrential rain like this. And what was more is that we had 2 record-breaking floods within 6 weeks. Neither storm in and of itself was terrible, but the collision of several resulted in a surprising lack of operational resilience in a city that is a Great Lakes city, so you could call it a coastal city, but it was proven to be vulnerable. So we had our entire season of rain in these 2 storms, and we were simply unequipped to deal with it. Later on or earlier this summer, on the 22nd of June 2013, the Bow River overflowed its banks, and some of you may know the Bow River only by location. It flows out of the mountains in the Banff area, one of the more famous national parks in Canada, and completely leveled part of the city of Calgary. Which brings me to this slide that I promised I'd return to. On the 21st of December 2013, known as our winter solstice, we had a rainy day, surprisingly warm. The temperature hovered around 0 degrees for about 12 hours, during which time we had an entire fall's worth of rain. So the entire fall season's worth of rain fell in a very short period of time. And at supper time, on the winter solstice, the temperature plunged to minus 25 degrees. And it stayed there for 2 weeks. What a beautiful image. This is the morning, the day after the winter solstice. A gorgeous photograph and a beautiful day, high pressure system, cold Arctic air, minus 25 degrees. And all you could hear was cracking, and more cracking, and more cracking. And in a city of over 1 million trees, we lost 25% of our forest canopy overnight. And worse than that, of course, 5 million people, 500,000 of them were without power, heat, or light for 2 weeks over the Christmas holidays. So this is vulnerability of a different kind. No one had expected this. There was an enormous eruption of conversation about what it means to be resilient when you can't heat your home or light. And of course, when you do try to create a fire, which you do when you have all this wood available suddenly, we had, of course, what you would expect, an enormous problem with fires breaking out everywhere. So this is the kind of vulnerability that we've been talking about in the conversation of resilience. And in this season, again, this is not newsworthy. It's not going to break news stories across the continents. But for us, again, in my hometown, we had the highest Great Lakes levels in more than 60 years because we had so much spring rain. We also had a lot of snow at one portion of the area where this water comes from, creating ice jams. And so the point I'm making is it doesn't necessarily take these colossal, huge superstorms and hurricanes. It's the combination of events that occur close together in surprising ways that is opening up conversations about what it means to be resilient. These are some more images from that same high lake levels taken on very gray days in our spring. Our beaches were inundated. There was really an unbelievable amount of water everywhere. And that brings me to right now. In the fall season of the North Atlantic, the hurricanes have been unprecedented, not because we've had more of them that have been so large, but because the power of the individual storms has been so dramatic. Everyone, I think, around the world has heard about Houston's battle with Hurricane Harvey. And the image here is not because the hurricane itself was so strong, but because the rain that stuck around with this low pressure system that stayed, and we had 6 days of rain that caused an area that has no planning for all intents and purposes, where more people are allowed to build on flood vulnerable areas because there is no regulation. This became a real problem. The hurricane in and of itself was not so much the problem. So these images remind us that when we're looking at storms, and we're talking about the frequency and magnitude of storms increasing over time, particularly under these scenarios of climate change, what we're seeing isn't quite that simple. It's not the giant size of Hurricane Irma, or the fact that within 3 weeks we had 3 very powerful hurricanes all occurring in more or less the same path, which itself is pretty unusual. All of this gives us pause to stop and understand, what does it mean to design for a climate that is surprising us in ways that are potentially catastrophic? So these are policy triggers for a planning conversation on what it means to be resilient. The first of these was Hurricane Katrina, that resulted in a variety of programs for Louisiana, and in particular for New Orleans, everything from the Dutch dialogues, conversations with our friends in the Netherlands who routinely live below sea level, to the green, very controversial green dot plan that suggested people move out of flood risk areas, very controversial, particularly given the environmental injustices and social injustices for people who are living in the poorest areas were also the most vulnerable. And still there is no water management plan that is legislative. There's a coastal strategy, and there are very significant movements that are community driven towards local resilience. But that was the first wave of conversation. That's now 12 years ago. Superstorm Sandy gave us the Rockefeller program. It gave us Rebuild by Design and Vision 2020, a plan for metropolitan New York's flood vulnerability. The flood and ice storms across northeastern North America, not just in Toronto, these gave us some very interesting policies and programs designed to be resilient. We'll unpack what that means in just a moment. Principally because most of these storms were in Canada and the legislative framework is different in Canada from parts of the United States, we were able to do some very interesting things, including linking our policies across scales from the municipal to the regional and enforcing development areas. For example, we brought in Canada's first, actually it's North America's first mandatory green roof plan that demanded all institutional and commercial facilities over a certain square meterage required to have green roofs that absorb and hold water. The Greenbelt Act that stores green land for water infiltration is a very important part of our thinking around what it means to be resilient. And here we have the big moment of the hurricane season that is not yet over. We have another 6 to 8 weeks in North American hurricane season. And we're already at the letter N in naming the hurricanes. I think now Nate is passed and we're on to O and P. Not sure what you do in a season where you pass 26, but we're going to find out. And in this particular case, I'd argue that the evidence seems to suggest we're going to see massive flood insurance restructuring or even elimination because the insurance industries are very clear that this can't be sustained. So if we're not going to plan and we're not going to design and we can't insure, I'm not sure what the options are, but I do know that we ought to start looking at design as an option. So all of this leads me to argue consistently for some time that climate change means we absolutely need new planning design, but we don't need it later, we need it now. We're already probably 15 to 20 years behind. So we need to plan for adaptation, and we also need to design for what resilience really means. And Rockefeller has offered us some ideas. What they've offered us really is funding for a chief resilient officer. I guess Sydney has a chief resilience officer. How's that going? Are you 2 years in now? So we're a bit early to take stock of what's been achieved, particularly in comparing one city to the other. So the argument that I'd make then is, well, we have to understand really what it is we're assessing when we talk about being resilient in the face of vulnerability. And there are lots of reasons to be resilient that have nothing to do with storm vulnerability. But we could start there because that's a pretty urgent moment. First of all, in just general lay terms, we talk about resilience being the capacity to deal with stress and adversity. It's often in the media, particularly after a storm event, characterized as the ability to get back to normal, the ability to put the lights on. And so, in fact, some say that it's just getting back to normal as quickly as possible without any real understanding of the normal that got you into the problem in the first place. Maybe that's not the normal you need to get back to. We also need to understand that the psychological literature, even the military literature, particularly from the US, talks a lot about resilience as a personal quality, that we ought to have a positive outlook in the face of challenge, that we should individually become more adaptable in the face of challenge. So there's a really strong connection to psychological literature that is meant to help us think socially and culturally about what it is to get back to normal. But there's a problem with that phrase, particularly when you unpack what resilience means from a different discipline. We might ask, from a health perspective, for example, how much change is okay? When you're in the business of getting back to normal, how much is it okay to be changed? The capacity to absorb some kind of stress or adversity or any kind of disturbance, to reorganize and to continue to function, suggests bouncing back to normal. But that's not quite true. After an event that puts you at serious risk, generally speaking, we don't get back to normal. We evolve to some different state, and we take with us the lessons that we learned along the way. Health analogies are helpful. Following disease, some would argue that if the disease doesn't debilitate you or kill you. Even if it harms you in a small way, you can recover. You can actually be improved by it. You can learn new skills. You can become immune to something. So we're getting back to a different state of normal. And the emphasis here in this very subtle nuance, which is most often lost in policy documents and certainly in public media, is that there is an adaptive and transformational capacity built into the idea of resilience that is lost in the public domain. This essential quality of transforming under stress is what's interesting to me and what is increasingly possible for designers to unpack. So we could talk about structural and functional resilience, and they may not be the same. Several years ago, together with my colleague Pierre Bélanger, who was referenced in the introduction, we undertook a studio with our students at Harvard University in the Netherlands, and we worked with the Dutch government to examine what might it be like if certain areas that had been kept dry were allowed to flood. How would the landscape be reformed? What parts of the landscape could be reclaimed? And we designed a series of maps and drawings along with landowners to understand the movement of water if it were given more room. This is now a very well-known plan by the Dutch, the Room for the Rivers plan. And our students even asked the question, what if the very famous Dutch DNAP, the dynamic Normal Amsterdam's level, was recast? Instead of being a static dot on this bar, what if the sea level was considered a gradient along which there was a range of normal and within which it fell, rather than always being described as one point? In the words of Brian Walker, who's I think an Australian actually here at CSIRO, much of his publications have talked a lot about resilience being this capacity of how to change in order that you are not passively changed, in order not to be changed. That's, again, a very subtle but important distinction. How can you learn how to change proactively? So if we unpack resilience, there's some themes emerging that have to do with dynamic living systems that themselves are changing, that surprise us in unique ways. And there are origins to this thinking in ecological system science, which is my own introduction to notions of resilience. It actually came from studying living systems, in particular forest habitats, forest and water interface habitats. So as far back as the 1950s, depending on how you cast it, even the 1920s, early general systems theory and ecological systems theories talks a lot about the importance of resilience. And importantly, resilience isn't always a good thing. It can be pathological, being stuck in one place, coming back to the same normal state if that normal state is not good for you. That's not necessarily a desirable thing. So some of this literature is very helpful in understanding how living systems manage. One of the more recent works that came about in the 1990s, recent from an ecological systems perspective, is the linking of human cultural systems, agroecosystems, forested ecosystems, resource-based systems. And it stands to reason then that there's a lot of literature that came out of both Canada and Australia, and for the same reason, Sweden, actually. These are countries that have high resource extraction and that studied their ecosystems from a perspective of resource yield. And so this literature really helps evolve some of the ideas around resilience that later got picked up around risk and vulnerability. In fact, Fritz Steiner's most recent book, Design for a Vulnerable Planet, picks up many of these ideas and applies them to climate-based vulnerability. The lessons that come from that body of literature, though, are really that, in a nutshell, ecosystems, the material of our landscapes, the material building blocks of landscape architecture, I'd argue, these are understood as complex and diverse, resilient and unpredictable. Unpredictable meaning it's hard to plan for them in the way that we might a more mechanized system. And that's disconcerting to us, particularly as planners. In these systems, change is embedded within that living system. It's both discontinuous and sometimes gradual. And surprising events, in the words of C.S. Halling, are normal. This is a useful term, surprise. We all understand what it means. It suggests that while we know a certain thing may be inevitable, we can't predict with precise certainty when it will occur. We know the hurricanes are normal at this time of year in the North Atlantic, for example. And the longer we live in a place, the more we know what the patterns are. And we can tell when those patterns are shifting and changing. So it means that different kinds of knowledge become important. Holling used this term creative destruction to describe when a surprising change event in our landscape happens, and what does that do for us in terms of design? Does it open up opportunity? Do we see it as a way to make change? Or do we force fit the way we've been doing things back into that same pattern of doing? The point in this slide is that there are many possible stable states or steady states that we can live in. Some of them are not good for us. Others are constantly changing. The question for planning and design is, well, which states do we want? Which are desirable? Which are livable? And so if we embed this in our way we make decisions for planning and design, we might say that we need to design for a diversity of species and people. We need to adapt to change because change is normal to some extent. And sometimes, in the most catastrophic or dynamic situations, we need the capacity to transform. That's never been part of the political conversation of resilience. That's a pretty unpalatable thing, unless we start to internalize it into our design tactics. I'd also like to suggest that much of the literature and the public practice right now around resilience says we need the ecosystem to work for us. It's got to provide services. And if it provides services, then maybe we can do something about those. And of course, in the place where I come from, most of those ecosystem services that we put a dollar on, we don't see them at a certain point. We remove them, and then they have a value. But while the tree is standing, it doesn't have much of a value yet. And so we've tried to recast that dialogue in many cases, particularly around landscape and design, to ecosystem solutions. That's a little bit different than services. It may help to value some of those services if one must make an economic argument, but if one makes a longer term argument for the diversity of habitats and people, the solution set might be the whole ecosystem. It also has particular implications for how we do things. In particular, for me at least, it's much more helpful to shift the burden of responsibility in thinking about what we used to call environmental management to human management. We haven't really done such a great job of managing the environment. How's that going for you here? Is it working out, managing the environment? It's not working out in many places. In fact, the management tactics have exacerbated the problems in some cases. So we think more about making it a human problem. Human problems of design challenge is something we can manage. But managing the object out there is a psychological difference. It means that the way in which we gain knowledge has to come from a variety of different fields. It also means that local history and landscape values matter very much. The traditional ways of doing things or indigenous knowledge becomes very important in places for which we have little contemporary scientific knowledge, or even where that's not providing a useful solution set. The urgency of our decisions as well, I would argue, and have argued many times in our lab's work, that we need to experiment, but we need to experiment safely, at a threshold that when we fail safely. We only learn when we fail. So we cannot afford to make our designed experiments on such a large scale that they fail catastrophically. So small-scale experimentation that's safe to fail becomes really important. It also speaks to why designers need to work closely with academics in different disciplines so that we can actually test our knowledge in places that learn to project resilience. Projecting resilience means to think about how to integrate social urban systems with ecological systems that sustain us. So reintegrating our human culture with nature wherever possible. I'm going to show you a series of images that show how we've had our students and practitioners think about ideas about resilience. This is a studio at the University of Toronto, together with my colleague Jane Wolfe, in which we asked our students at both our universities to not draw a thing, a tactile object, but to draw a policy. Give us a cross-sectional diagram of how water moves in the city of New Orleans. And along the bottom axis, tell us what's happening to the water related to different pieces of policy. This is a diagram that policymakers had never really thought about before. And it also helped them to understand the levee system in a legislative world where the people who manage the intake and output pipes of water don't speak to one another. So these kinds of diagrams can be learning tools in thinking about a whole system so that we can begin to think about what it means to adapt to change In other words, to be resilient. We compared that with the city of Toronto, which physically, of course, is very different, but which has also a completely different policy regime, one where there's legislation around where you can build and where you can't, and where underground piping is very much well known. So these two diagrams in and of themselves were really an exercise in designing for policy. Similarly, we can see lots of examples in master planning design competitions where designers have been asked to think about different rule sets, where all of a sudden, if you are structuring a wetland in an urban area, you're not accommodating the wetland to the city, but rather you're accommodating the city to the wetland. That's a reversal of the burden of evidence, and it's also a powerful way to design differently. This for the lower Dawnlands, where we are reconfiguring the mouth of one of the city's major rivers, the largest urbanized watershed in Canada. Similarly, the same designer, in this case I'm working with Chris Reed. This is an example from Massachusetts where a river is being depicted in terms of its floodability, rather than as a line of blue, or a blue line onto a map. Rather than a blue line that's confined to a map between two straight lines, the river is being shown as a series of points, of dots, that at different water levels looks differently. It's a very simple act, but what it does is show that the river's dynamic. It's not simply water as two lines on a map. And this map changes with the seasons as well. In the similar exercise, we were asked in just outside Toronto. This is a city which has the name London and also conveniently has the River Thames, but it's not in England, it's in one of its other colonies in Canada. The river here is the confluence of two smaller rivers, and the city is dealing with a flooding problem. And rather than just doing the traditional levee system and diking, we were asked to think of the two arms of the river where one is an area of conveyance and the other is an area of delay. So one portion of the river is going to be designed to convey and move water, the other to slow, hold, and delay. Bless you. And the design tactics will look very differently. And from a series of wetlands and play parks that are designed to be inundated and wet some of the times of the year, and dry or frozen at others, and this is very important, in coming from a winter culture, we very rarely see images of water in its static state. We love to show summer images in Canada. We really do. I think we are completely in love with the summer image, but really we need to make very good friends with the winter image, particularly from a design point of view, because this shows the temporality and the ephemerality of the states that make us vulnerable. Is there a way in which we can slow and hold and capture water in its frozen state in a way that allows us to, for example, benefit from it as a public space? This is well known in winter cities, of course, but it's rarely shown in this way. I have lots of other examples, but I'll skip through them to make the point mostly that these exercises were about recasting things that we already do to help us think through what resilience is. Lake Ontario Park is not a new park. It's a collection of 5 or 6 even existing parks being threaded together to create a larger network of areas that are designed to slow, hold, and infiltrate water during high lake levels and during storm events, but also to create areas, of course, for multifunctional recreation, enjoyment in park, a more ornamental park, and so on. They're also designed for wildlife movement in 4 seasons. This is the park by James Corner in Toronto. One example only, and I could show many, but one that perhaps stands out from the Rebuild by Design competition in New York City is Kate Orff and her office Scape's proposal for living breakwaters. This is a series of using natural inspired infrastructure of the coral reef, but using built infrastructure to emulate coral reefs around Manhattan to actually dissipate the wave energy in high water season. But more important than that, these structures are made from reclaimed objects, from refuse and detritus, and even by having the community members help to build these infrastructures. So there's an element of community coming together to understand what it means to, not to fortify necessarily, but to create a living network around their community. We've seen other examples of estuary making here from our studio in the Netherlands, recreating of tidal flats and oyster texture, as Kate will call it. My students at my own university in Ryerson also do this for policy. we recently created a series of 4 handbooks for city planners and designers in Toronto and in Chicago called Wet Infrastructure, building with blue and green infrastructure. So the idea that we're doing more than civil engineering of pipes, roads, bridges, and sewers, but reclaiming the landscape as a vital part of green and blue infrastructure. So this handbook shows best and next practices in what the students called wet infrastructure to get policymakers thinking about the infrastructure itself as vital for resilience. All of these ideas are not about grand designs for a thing, an object of infrastructure necessarily, but rather about linking landscapes at multiple scales, linking these living systems connected by their ecosystems, sometimes by habitat, but mostly for people and the places they inhabit, so that these green and blue infrastructures create a series of linked networks. The networks themselves become part of resilience, and they build resilience for the region. I'll be talking more about ideas about blue and green infrastructure from a design perspective this week at the AILA Third City Conference, and hopefully some of you will be there. It looks like a terrific lineup of talks, this being only one of these opportunities for infrastructure. If we ask ourselves, what does it mean to activate this? There's the theory, we've unpacked a little bit of the practice. What does it mean to activate resilience through the agency of design? And I'd say, as a basic principle, the first role of planning is to illuminate a variety of options rather than a single large-scale solution, to project a series of desirable futures where transdisciplinary knowledge from a variety of disciplines and agencies are contributing to the challenge ahead. No single agency owns resilience. Chief resilience officer or no, governance systems need to be reorganized in a way so that we share knowledge, and we share it in a much more basic way. We also need empirical evidence, which suggests partnerships and collaborations with our research institutes have to be more agile. They have to be small scale, experimental in practice, but they also need to involve our practicing colleagues. So how can we link funded research to public and private sector small scale developments that are not just prototypical or demonstrable, although sometimes they are that, but where their performance is tracked? The performance of a new green roof and a green wall system that connects into the city park system. Do we know how much stormwater is being diverted? I don't think anyone would suggest that these kinds of green infrastructural solutions themselves replace big pipe, bless you, but they rather do contribute, and significantly. We know that we're moving at least 20 to 30% sometimes of stormwater runoff just through green roofs and living walls alone. That's a huge number of the liters that we get falling in a storm event. It doesn't replace the big pipe, but it sure takes the burden off it, particularly in urbanizing areas where the underlying pipe systems are not big enough for the growth that we've seen since the time that original infrastructure was put in. This means also then that we favor contextual solutions. That which works in Sydney in your climate, which is dry until it's suddenly wet, is not necessarily the same system that we use in a 4-season climate or a climate where we have 6 months of winter. We know that place-based solutions, we learn from each other, but we adapt them to the unique nuances of our own areas. I'm acutely aware that here, your problems with water have to do with too little for a long period of time, and then suddenly a lot, and probably not in the place you most need it. And this is the pattern we see in a variety of industrial nations where urban development has happened very rapidly as well. The ability to monitor and learn from small scale, these safe-to-fail experiments that I spoke about earlier, is really critical, and yet there's no funding for this. When private sector developers, even public agencies, finish with a project, if it's turnkey, they walk away. Nobody is monitoring it, usually, or providing feedback into the next cycle of planning and design where real adaptation could take place. So we know this is a real niche, and we know it's a niche for design studios that being the pedagogy of the university programs that train our professionals. We have the capacity to launch these small studios that are usually 12 to 15 weeks in length with perhaps half a dozen to 20 students, where they can in real time make something. They can design a project, a policy, they can test something, they can work with a public sector agency, and there's the capacity with a funded laboratory to continue that cycle of learning. And we're beginning to do that. The design schools are a real opportunity here, much more so than the traditional disciplines. We know that ecological literacy, even explaining to people, showing and revealing landscape functions, is helpful in moving to a culture where we understand more about what it is to build with blue and green infrastructure, or for resilience, for example. So we know that this metaphor is a useful one, even in places that, so much so, that in some places we are now designing them to be flood adaptive, where this water level, this is a public park and community center in Toronto that's designed to flood. This is what it looks like at least 3 to 4 days of every spring. This spring it was 6 days and they blew their flood budget. But it's okay, it can handle this. The public, a major community support group, understands this and in fact celebrates the high water. We're not really there financially, but spiritually, emotionally, behaviorally, people understand this and don't see it as a problem. They say, oh, the water is high on the river, so this week there will be different activities. Or this week we can't go into the community center, but we can use the stormwater pond that is now suddenly a fishing pond. And we know there are hundreds of thousands of small, tiny plot projects, from bioswales to rain barrels to downspout disconnect programs to, even just amazing street tree cover with really good silvocell structure underneath, along with permeable pavement in climates that allows it. We know about these projects, and we know that individually they may not seem like much, but when stitched together, or linked together in a policy system, or designed together in a large park system, then we have a resilient network to talk about. These projects are not irrelevant. They can be very small, but when spoken about as part of a network, they mean something. Even here in Vancouver, the noise abatement system and rainwater catch system in the SkyTrain is beautiful to look at. One of the multifunctional benefits of this piece of green infrastructure connected into the park system, by the way, is that when passengers are waiting for a train, they perceive the wait time to be shorter when looking at the wall. This doesn't actually make the train come faster, we've discovered, but it does feel like it comes faster. The beautiful park, Red Ribbon Park by Kongjianyu Tangyi River Park, which is very well published in landscape architecture literature. I show this not only because it's beautiful and iconic, but because it's a restored wetland in the service of a public park with a simple device that is incredibly evocative. And we can learn from these designs. While in and of itself, people don't look at this and think, stormwater remediation, a reconstructed wetland, green infrastructure for resilience. No, they think of it as a beautiful place to play, and also some iconic photography at this point in time. Berlin's Südgelände Naturpark, here in an old abandoned railway that just happens to connect into one of the largest urban forests in Europe. Largest forest by accident in the Cold War, but by luck now as a major piece of the city's flood amelioration program. And also, by the way, a very nice place to be. A very well-used and well-loved public park. Some of my own work in the lab that we're doing in Western Canada involves creating infrastructure that move people and wildlife safely. Why? Well, for resilience for sure, but also because the number of collisions with animals of a particular large size are dangerous. You know something about that here in Australia. But we also know that these habitats are in some places on a collision course with human habitats. And so these animals need to move safely off the roads, not on them. Even in Florida, there is that problem. And so we're working with infrastructure that takes a bridge and does something different with it. Moves wildlife across a busy motorway safely, at the same time as providing an amenity for people, a recreational amenity on their bike tracks underneath, but is a testing ground for ecological experiments. In this particular example, it's hypothetical. It's a Dutch design for a thin shell concrete with a landscape surface. And the one that is being built presently is done by HNTB along with MVVA Michael van Valkenburg architects, landscape architects. And this is a modular crossing that is literally the creation of a new landscape. You can think of it as a bridge or a tunnel, depending on the vantage point of your viewing, but it moves large carnivores safely across a roadway where collisions to humans are deadly. They're also, by the way, deadly to the wildlife. But the insurance companies are very interested in funding this, not to say least that these are landscaped surfaces that absorb, slow, and hold water in addition to providing a variety of ecosystem-based solutions. So this is another way to think about resilience. This isn't about flood control, although it is about water infiltration. They're much more about thinking in a resilient way across landscapes that have a variety of habitats, and not just for people. There are examples in Edmonton of the same type of crossing structures. And most of all, even in our own city, my own city of Toronto, of 5 million people, we're looking to use the park spaces that we have, our rich legacy of river ravines that are not formal parks, but they are actually areas of conservation. Why? For flood control. They were set aside in the 1950s after a hurricane, and nobody could develop on them. And they have turned into an accidental resource that is now stitched together an incredible green area of almost 18,000 hectares running right through the middle of the city. In fact, many cities have this potential. How we recast it and how we think about it and talk about it under the climate of resilience matters much. It's a matter of making use of the resources we already have. Here is a very simple but beautiful artist's rendering of the ravine system in our downtown public park to help people understand the connection of these park places on a very large scale. It also happens that when it rains, that the living wall absorbs the water, and you can actually see how the ravines work in an artistic format. None of this is out of the radar globally. The recent Habitat 3 conference and the setting of the new urban agenda speaks specifically to the linking of urban biodiversity, health, and resilience. So we know there's a global agenda here. These are not just New World problems, and they're certainly not just big city problems. But they are very much going to be the problem of the landscapes our children will only know, and those are in the largest cities. So it's well worth thinking now about how we can capitalize on the assets we have to recast them through the lens of resilience, and at the same time to be testing them, adapting them, and valuing the change that's coming. I'd argue that if we really want to be resilient beyond the popular rhetoric, then we actually must have to embrace the kind of complexity, expect the uncertainty, and actually revel in the biodiversity around us. We have to cultivate a new agency for design. And that really starts here, a kind of new sustainability through design that is compassionate, collaborative, and biophilic. And all of this is a way for us to reaffirm the landscapes that we call home and the landscapes that sustain us. Thank you very much.